Kitco Mining's special coverage of the Vancouver Resource Investment Conference is brought to you by Snowline Gold.
Hello and welcome to Kitco Mining here at the Vancouver Resource Investment Conference with me, Paul Harris. Joining me now is someone I always enjoy interviewing and someone I always learn a lot from, and that is Warren Irwin, President and Chief Investment Officer at Rosseau Asset Management. Warren, welcome back to Kitco.
Well, thanks for having me, Paul.
Let's see what trouble we can get into today.
We seem to stir up a bit of trouble every time we chat.
Yes, but all good. Let's start by looking back at last year. How was 2024? What are some of the main narratives in the resource investment space from last year that are perhaps carrying forward into this year?
Yeah, it wasn't a super exciting time last year. You know, gold obviously was one of the most exciting parts. It hit a record high, and I guess the big surprise to many people is the follow-through did not really happen to the extent people thought it would in the equities. So commodity did well, but there wasn't really a huge follow-through in the equities. Some of the obviously the majors did well, but the juniors, there was no follow-through really. So that concerned a lot of people.
Is that something that perhaps you think will be addressed this year or catch up this year?
You know, it's really tough to know. You know, it depends what gold does. If it could back off a bit, I don't think there'll be any catch-up. If it continues to rally, perhaps we'll get some interest. The biggest issue really right now in the gold sector, and the speculative juniors anyways, is, you know, we're competing with funds with the crypto market, right, and the NASDAQ. And both of those are doing fantastically well. Even to a certain extent, maybe the S&P 500. So all those three categories have been doing fantastic. So why invest in junior resource stocks when, you know, last 12 months you got a fantastic return on the S&P 500? You see the nutty crypto action here the last few days with these Trump coins, and you've seen the Bitcoin. So, you know, that's where the crazy money's going right now. It's not coming into our sector, and so we're competing with that. It's a competitive market. We've got to compete with that.
Now, there's some big, let's say, geopolitical themes that are potentially going to impact the natural resource sector. And let's start with where we are right now in Canada. A few weeks ago, Prime Minister Justin Trudeau resigned, and the likelihood is that voters will return a Conservative government. So would a new government reinvigorate Canada's resource industries, and what policies do you think they should prioritise in order to strengthen Canada's resource sector?
Yeah, well, that's exactly true. Pierre Poilievre, I've met with him quite a number of times, specifically regarding resources. I think, let's say in the oil sector, the first thing you need to do is we need to get different outlets for both our natural gas and our oil. We need some LNG facilities for sure. So we stop selling our gas to the U.S., start shipping it international, get a much better price for it. We're kind of got stranded gas here in Canada. With respect to oil, our oil is pretty much stranded. It has, you know, pipelines are going to the U.S. The U.S. are getting a huge deal on our oil. We need pipelines to the west and to the east, and we need to get this product out under the international markets. On the mining sector, the biggest thing killing us in Canada is permitting. Like, permitting timelines are monstrously long, and I think Pierre realizes that, and he'll do what he can to get permitting streamlined, because we need to get back to business. Our GDP per capita during the entire 9 years Trudeau has been in office has not budged. We've got tremendous cost of living, yet we've got terrible incomes and terrible GDP per capita. We need to get back to business. Enough of the socialist experiment, and let's get a slimmer, more efficient government. Let's get some pipelines built, then we have some LNG plants built. Let's reduce the permitting hurdles on a lot of the mining projects. Let's get going. Let's get building Canada.
Now, south of the border today, Donald Trump was sworn in as the 47th President of the United States, and he's spoken a lot about the need to reinvigorate the energy sector. He's talking about pipelines. The Keystone Pipeline is obviously a big one that was blocked or development was stopped. How do you see things playing out with, you know, a potentially Conservative government here in Canada, Trump in the United States? Will these pipeline developments, LNG terminals, etc., that you've just mentioned, will these things start to happen?
Yeah, I believe so. Yeah, both. You know, Pierre understands the position we are here in Canada. We basically, over the Trudeau years, we've doubled our national debt to $1 trillion. We're running monstrous deficits. So we need to get back to work. We need to start cutting some costs, cutting the size of government, and getting back to business and start generating some income so that people have make some money and start fighting some of this lackadaisical 9 years of economic disaster in Canada. In the U.S., like under Biden, it's not as if things are going great either. And, they've lost control of the border in the U.S. They have a tremendous number of problems. But Trump, with, some of the tremendous backing he has, some of his experts on his team, they know what the serious problems are and they're getting to work on them. So it's basically problem solving in both north of the border and south of the border.
I want to follow up on your comments about permitting times here in Canada, and perhaps take the conversation into a delicate area, if I may, and that's the aspect of First Nations and some of the sort of treaty protections that First Nation groups across the country enjoy at a provincial and federal level. A lot of the treaties convey certain rights and benefits on the First Nations, which some people argue allow them to effectively block resource development. Can and should certain treaty aspects be, readdressed to unlock permitting and resource development? And if so, how can that be done?
Yeah. Well, across Canada, there are a number of different treaties and non-treaties, and so making a blanket statement about working with the First Nations is a tricky. You can't do that. Basically, there are very progressive First Nations who want jobs for their people, want resource development in their traditional lands, and they're moving forward. But there are some other groups that are quite backwards. They're living in swamps in the middle of nowhere, fly in, fly out, and they want to be left alone. Yet, they're taking monstrous amounts of cash from our federal government, yet doing everything they can to stop, our country from making money off the resources on their land. And sometimes this land is that mines are being permitted on, like 500 kilometers away from the village, right? So there's various levels of cooperations around the country, and there's groups that are enlightened and some that are not enlightened. But so it's a bit of a mixed bag. I also deal with First Nations in other countries. For instance, in Australia, we're dealing with traditional landowners of Australia, and there's various trends going around the world. And I think what's happening, what I'm seeing just generally is, certainly we're seeing this in Australia, where people are tired of living in poverty on a number of the indigenous lands, and they want some economic development. They want first world jobs for their children and for the families, and they understand that the mining of today is not the mining of 50 years ago, and that the environmental damage isn't what it used to be, and they want prosperity for their people. But there are some groups that don't want that and will do everything they can to block everything. So you're getting a mixture, but I'm seeing a little bit of a trend where generally Indigenous communities globally are becoming a little more progressive and want to share in the wealth created with mineral development. And you're also seeing that too in natural gas and in oil too.
For the First Nation groups that don't want to participate in resource development, can and should the federal government make moves to try and force that?
Yeah, no, that's a tricky one, because as you know, under Trudeau, it's been the pendulum swings, and under Trudeau, it's basically give First Nations where there is a level of discretion, give them maximum discretion. Say, okay, even though this project is a bazillion miles away from your village, you have a say, and you could stop resource development of a multi-billion-dollar project because you don't want it. So that I don't see the case where the Canadian government will be forcing them, but perhaps cajoling them and working with them and just showing them the benefits. I think that's probably a more appropriate way to work with them. And there are some good groups throughout Canada that are, they want to be part of this Canadian economic dream here, but we really haven't had an economic dream the last 9 years. So let's get out there and work with the First Nations who want to work with the mining industry, and let's get moving forward and creating win-win situation for both the mining companies, the federal government, provincial government, and the local communities, so we all benefit from the tremendous resource endowment we have.
Thank you. Last week with Kitco Mining, I was at the Future Minerals Forum in Riyadh in Saudi Arabia. And it was clear to me that Saudi Arabia is positioning itself as a non-aligned friend of the world to the world's mining sector. And it struck me that that was perhaps a position that 10 to 15 years ago Canada occupied. It seems that Canada's really losing that position in the world. It's increasingly politically aligned, choosing friend or foe, that kind of thing. Is that a legitimate observation?
Yeah, it is. It is. I first met the Saudis back in London probably about 8 years ago. I met the Minister of Mines, and they were outlining to me their strategy, which was we want to make Saudi, a leader in mining globally. And I explained to them, I said, it's nice to think that, but you have some tremendous untapped resources in your country, but we haven't drilled them up to know what you indeed have. So I encourage them to be more of a regional hub, where Saudi will be the center of all mining activity in the areas of North Africa and the Middle East. And so they took that and ran with it, and they're hosting a tremendous conference. I was a speaker at the first conference, and I saw the amount of effort that the Saudis were putting into it. I saw the smiles on the face of the young Saudis who were really keen to be part of that. So they're really pushing hard on that. And then you contrast that with Canada, where we've had a Liberal government which has been just highly destructive of our industry, which is one of the cornerstones of Canada. And we've got a government, for instance, you're probably aware of what happened with Solaris. That's a poster child for our government interference, where our federal government thought it would be a good idea to block an investment by the Chinese into Ecuador.
So that's Solaris Resources. Zijin Mining was going to invest $130 million Canadian into the company for the development of the Warintza copper gold project.
Yeah. So that was a complete and total embarrassment. And let's say you're myself trying to invest in a Canadian listed copper company. Well, there's no more mid-tier copper companies. There's nobody. The investment climate in Canada is pretty dismal. So where are you going to get the money? Well, you're going to get the money from the Chinese. And if you're Canadian listed, you can't get the money from the Chinese. So you got a bit of a problem there, right? And it's really hampering our industry. And to the point where I remember I had some friends who went to the mining ministry and said, okay, what are you doing here? You're trying to destroy our business? And they're saying, well, we're getting directions from above. And then another minister apparently piped up to them on the side and said, well, why don't you just re-domicile in another country? So we have our ministers in the Liberal government telling our mining companies to leave the country so that we could take money from the Chinese to develop the projects. And we're talking not projects within Canada, projects in Ecuador, in Africa, around the world. They are intentionally destroying the Canadian mining business. It is absolutely outrageous. And I think Pierre Poilievre is aware of many of these issues from speaking with a number of people in the mining industry, that hopefully we'll get some of these issues corrected and we get back to business.
Now, something does seem very broken there, and it was evident in Saudi Arabia. There are a lot of Canadian juniors and Canadian geologists and Canadian CEOs are there looking for money, looking for projects in Saudi Arabia because, to paraphrase, it's great to be in a country where the government actually wants us to do things and supports us to get there.
Yeah. Well, mining industry is not alone. Like just ask Daniel Smith in Alberta how much support she's getting from our federal government with respect to blocking all accesses to the ocean to get our product out of our country. They are hamstringing Alberta, and then with all these carbon limits they're trying to jam down their throats. Our federal government is destroying two of the major industries in our country, yet they somehow think there's going to be money around for social programs. And guess what? That's not the case. And I'm being rather frank here. You just do the math. It's math doesn't lie, right? They're just, so.
Okay, let's get back on to gold and silver. The gold and silver prices increased handsomely last year, but gold stocks did not respond in kind. How do you see 2025 playing out for stocks? Will it be the catch-up year, or will investors continue to ignore them?
I think the investors will continue to ignore them. I don't see a catch-up year here. Like I said, we are competing globally with Bitcoin, all crypto, the NASDAQ, and the S&P 500. Mostly crypto and the NASDAQ. We saw this kind of in early 2000s when the NASDAQ cracked and was down 75% in 2000. The same speculative money that was invested in those stocks, got hammered pretty hard. They got pulled out of the sector. Now they're saying, well, we're another good speculative market to get involved in, and they turned to the Canadian junior resource market, and we had a really good 10 years, and a lot of money was made. But we need to have a reason for people to look at our sector, and right now they're looking at other sectors which are frankly returning tremendous returns for them. And until that stops, we won't get those funds. But valuations on those sectors, on both tech and crypto, are pretty stretched. So who's to know how long that'll take? It might be 6 months, might be 2 years, but that'll eventually crack, and hopefully by the time when that does crack, we will be a very interesting alternative to invest in.
What about gold itself? What is your forecast for gold this year?
Yeah, well, it's very tough, if not impossible, to forecast gold over a short period like a year. But my view on gold, and I've been in the business many decades, gold is going up and up and up, without a doubt. Because, the reason it's guaranteed is that it is denominated in fiat currency. And one thing we could be sure of, more than almost anything in the world, is that the politicians will continue to print money and devalue the fiat currencies. So hence gold will continue to rise in price over time, without a doubt. It's almost 3,000 now. I can guarantee you it will hit $5,000. When? I don't know. But it will hit $5,000 because they're printing US dollars like crazy, and every day it's worth more and more, and sometimes it's reflected in the price of gold, sometimes it isn't. So you've got this big trend. Gold's going this way, but sometimes it's up, down, below, above and below this trend line. But gold is going higher. I can guarantee you that.
Well, let's talk about red gold. A lot of people think the copper price is going higher because of supply and demand dynamics, but the copper price is dug in quite firmly. Let's say $4 a pound for the past couple of years. $4 a pound historically is a very high level for copper, but is it the case that perhaps $4 a pound is that higher for longer price level, or is there still potential for it to go higher?
Yeah, well, the whole reason, Dr. Copper, right, is basically based on economic activity globally. And just recently, we've had this nonsense with the EV nonsense, right, and electrification, all that stuff. Well, I've yet to have an EV in my garage. I'm not a big fan of EVs, and there's not an EV on the market that I would even remotely think of ever buying, right? So I think there's a lot of people who are like that. You're seeing the slowing in the rate of acceptance of EVs. So this whole electrification thing is not really exactly going too well. So all that factored in optimism towards the price of copper is, I think, unfounded. And you just have to take that out of the equation. See, copper, it's a fantastic metal. It's being used in tons of applications globally, in construction and in grids and industrial development. And I think if you look back at that, copper will go where the economy goes. And I don't spend much time thinking about the EV stuff and the magical, you hear all sorts of nonsense out of the EV promoters that we're going to need, an Escondida every year or every 2 years or whatever the crazy numbers are saying. But here we are,
Okay.
We're $4 copper, we're not $10 copper.
I want to sort of finish on we'll stay on copper, but swing back round to what we were talking about earlier and US President Donald Trump. An ongoing copper story has been the closure of the Cobre Panama mine in Panama. President Trump has reiterated today that, yes, he wants to retake control of the Panama Canal, which the US built and operated for, I think it was 100 years before President Jimmy Carter, who died a few weeks ago, gave back to Panama. It seems a bonkers idea, but in Latin America, where I live, the governments are taking it very, very seriously and looking at all kinds of contingencies for if America does try to take back the Panama Canal. Is that a serious idea? Does it have any legs to it?
Well, Trump, both in dealing with that and the tariff threats to Canada, he's one to kind of throw out outlandish ideas. So then when you settle at something a little less outlandish than that, the country that you're dealing with thinks it's a win, right? So that's his negotiating style. Read of Art of the Deal, and you'll know that. So I think that's what's happening here. He's throwing out something pretty outlandish, and they'll come to agreement. I think what he's concerned mostly about is increased Chinese control of the Panama Canal. And given the amount, how important it is to America to have the Panama Canal not under control of the Chinese, I think he's doing a bit of a pushback on that. I find it personally a little humorous, though, that he's threatening to take back the Panama Canal not that long after the Panamanian government has taken over Cobre, Panama, and shut that down. So they're getting kind of a bit of their own medicine back at them, which is hilarious, frankly.
In what way does he think China is taking control of the Panama Canal?
Oh, I don't know. With relationships with the Panamanian countries, like for instance, it's where I see the Chinese taking control from the Americans, just like in Africa, right? Like they're all over Africa. They haven't fired a shot, yet they've got effective control of Africa, and America doesn't. And the Chinese are just moving in everywhere. They're moving into South America, they're moving into Africa, and they're controlling it. They've got strong economic ties, and the Americans are losing out, and the West is losing out because the Chinese are just taking over the world without an army, just increasing their economic ties with Africa and South America.
Well, imagine one way they are taking over control of the Panama Canal is through sending more ships through than everybody else. So they probably occupy more transit slots than anybody else. Okay, let's wrap up, Warren. 2025 is just beginning. What's your outlook for the year?
Well, I'm not, as you may have guessed, I'm not super duper optimistic. I think it'll be, what I'm looking for are, not necessarily a move in the beta, as in the rising sea lifts all the boats. I'm very much focused on very specific things, and there are some very specific things that are happening. Alpha meaning company-specific things that'll be significant enough that whether the market goes up or down, you'll make a lot of money doing that. So that's the kind of stuff I'm looking at right now. I haven't got any ones that I could just shout out right now, but there are some really, keep an eye out, there are some really interesting situations I'm reviewing and analyzing right now that will, despite a good market or bad market, should do very, very well. And so that's what I'm working on right now.
Well, I wish you all the success with those. Warren Irwin, thank you very much for joining us today.
Thank you, Paul.
And we have more to come from VRIC here in Vancouver in Canada, so stay tuned and don't forget to hit that subscribe button. I'm Paul Harris and this is Kitco Mining.
Kitco Mining's special coverage of the Vancouver Resource Investment Conference is brought to you by Snowline Gold.